Chapter 9, Global Atmospheric Changes. So Chapter 9 is actually about a variety of different topics, which we're going to talk about briefly in this 10-minute lecture overview. So what we're really going to talk about, global climate change, ozone depletion, and acid deposition, which really is global warming, a hole in the ozone layer, and acid rain. So let's start with very quickly the difference between weather and climate, just so you can understand what we mean by global climate change. We consider weather to be the conditions in the atmosphere at a given place and time. So it varies by hour, it varies from day to day. These include things like what you get when you look at the weather forecast on the news. They give you things like the temperature today, what was the high, what was the low. They give you the atmospheric pressure in millibars of mercury. They give you if there was any precipitation, how much fell. Was it cloudy? Was it humid? Was it windy? All of those things are weather conditions. When we're talking about climate, we're talking about the typical weather patterns that occur in a place over a period of years. So we're talking about average temperature and average precipitation. So for example, the example I like to use to talk about the difference between weather and climate is, when you're talking about weather, you might ask yourself, oh, do I need a coat to wear a coat today? Is it going to be cold? Whereas if you're asking a question about climate, do I even need to own a coat? If I live in Chicago, then the answer is yes, I do need to own a coat because we do have cold temperatures here. But if I live in Florida, then I probably don't need to own that coat because the climate there is different. So those are kind of the big differences between weather and climate. So we know the Earth has many different climates, and all the living things that are on this planet are very specifically adapted to live in those climates. They have all of the necessary features, both behavioral features and structural features, that enable them to live in those climates very happily. When we change climates quickly, when they become too hot, when they become too wet or too dry, what happens is animals and plants can't keep up. They can't just put on a coat if it gets too cold or take off a coat if it gets too hot. They're not capable of doing that. They have adapted to specifically live in those set of climatic conditions. And if things change too quickly, what we see extinctions happening. We see species disappearing. So what do we know about global climate change? Global climate change, global warming, whatever you would like to call it. We know that the Earth's average temperature is increasing. This is based on daily measurements we take by a whole host of different ways: meteorological stations, weather balloons, sea surface buoys. We do it a whole different way, a whole lot of ways. We know that global temperatures in the year 95 and in the 2000s have been the highest in the last 1,000 years. And actually, they just announced that 2016, once again, was the hottest year on record, which follows the hottest year on record in 2015, which follows the hottest year on record in 2014. You kind of get the idea here. In general, spring is coming to the northern hemisphere, which is where we are, about 6 days earlier, and autumn is coming about 5 days later than it used to in about the 1960s. We have more heat waves worldwide. We have more heat-related deaths. The sea levels are rising. Glaciers are retreating. There are more severe hurricanes. All of these things are a consequence of a warming planet. So this is just sort of data to show you, again, that the general trend in global temperature is rising. Scientists agree that humans are largely responsible for current climate change. And how many scientists agree? About 99.1% of scientists, if you want to know exactly how many scientists agree. We know that the Earth is going to continue to increase. How much is a matter of which kind of models you look at. It can be anywhere from 3 degrees to 7 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100. We're also going to see higher maximum temperatures, so record highs is what we're going to see more of. Fewer cold days, an increase in the heat index. Heat index, that's when you take into account the amount of humidity or moisture in the air coupled with the temperature. That sticky, humid, hot feeling, that's the heat index. And also changes in precipitation patterns. In general, dry places are going to get drier and wet places are going to get wetter. So it's not coincidental that California is in the midst of the worst drought that they've been in well over 100 years. That's not going to change anytime soon. Yes, they've recently got some precipitation, but it's not nearly enough to put a dent in the drought that they're having. Other places are going to continue to see very, very wet weather. So some parts of the south and the southeast have had flooding in the past year to 2 years, and we're probably going to see those patterns continue and maybe even increase. What's causing it? Increase in human activities. What do? We burn stuff. And when we burn stuff, we release what are called the greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases are mostly carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. But it also includes a few others, including chlorofluorocarbons, some man-made ozone, and actually water is technically considered greenhouse gas, but this doesn't increase due to us. That's a steady constant in the environment. So this particular graphic is showing you that, remember how I showed you that graph that showed the average global temperature was increasing? Here's another graph to show you with the same trend line, which is the amount of carbon dioxide concentration. It is also increasing. So if you notice, the two are kind of going up together. So how do greenhouse gases influence warming global temperatures? Well, all the sunlight that's coming from the sun, actually, I should say all the solar radiation that's coming from the sun. It includes other things just than light. But all of that is whatever isn't blocked by the atmosphere comes and it's absorbed at the surface. Okay, so then what the planet does is we radiate that back out as heat. So energy cannot be created or destroyed. If you're not familiar with that concept, what that means is the energy coming in from the sun has to turn into something, and it comes back out as heat. A lot of that heat goes right back out into the atmosphere. Some of that heat is trapped and it's absorbed by greenhouse gases. And here's the key here. If it weren't for greenhouse gases, our planet would be uninhabitable. We need that heat to keep our planet nice and toasty and warm. The problem is that as we have increased the amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we are keeping in too much of that heat. That's the issue. So what are we talking about problems here? You name it. Let's talk about sea levels rising. Let's talk about changes in precipitation patterns. We have entire island nations that will probably in the next 25, 30 years at most, will probably cease to exist because they are sitting at or slightly below sea level. And as sea levels rise, they're going to be the first to get wiped out. What else? We have impacts on agriculture. We're going to have more pests. We're going to have less water for irrigation. We might actually also see impacts on human health. We're going to see more heat-related deaths. We're going to see more disease-carrying mosquitoes expanding their range. Last summer, all the talk was about Zika and the Zika virus and how it was at first only contracted by people who had gone to other countries like South America. But now we know that people here in the United States actually did contract it from mosquito bites, specifically in Florida. That's because the mosquito that carries Zika is expanding its range northward. And this is what will continue to see with global climate change. Other impacts. We're going to have different types of animals that are more susceptible. So when you think of penguins, for example, who rely on the cold climate and the ice to survive. When you think of frogs, actually, they become very susceptible to a fungal disease if there's too much moisture. We have corals in the ocean that will bleach, which means all the little living animals inside of them die and they turn white because the oceans are acidifying. Oceans actually absorb gaseous carbon dioxide. When they do that, it turns into carbonic acid, and that's the acid level that we're talking about in the ocean. So what do? What's the answer? Well, we can deal with it in one of two ways, mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation means that we're going to postpone the effects by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation means we just deal with the consequences. Honestly, we're going to have to do both in order to make it through this. So what do we do for mitigation? Use things other than fossil fuels. That's probably one of the big ones. Reduce our energy use. Increase efficiencies. Plant more trees to absorb some of that carbon dioxide. How do we adapt? Well, we're going to have to move coastal settlements inland. There's no way around it. You can't stop the seas from rising, but what you can do is you can move people inland. You can try to build walls to see if that will help prevent some of the saltwater intrusion. Find different crops to grow. You'll have to do a better job of sitting planning, including stormwater runoff and sewer systems, especially when you have precipitation events that bring in lots and lots of rain, which, again, these are all things we expect to increase as we see increasing global average temperatures. So it's important to note that this is a social, economic, and political problem. It's a problem for everyone worldwide. We tend to put a lot of focus on bringing down our carbon emissions, mostly through bringing down, burning less fossil fuels. But the problem is that developed countries like the United States and Europe and Japan and everyone else, we have more per person CO2 emissions than any other countries do. But we're doing a good job of leveling off our emissions or slightly reducing them, whereas other countries, China and India, places like that, are actually increasing. So there's a lot of debate on what we should do. And again, that's unfortunately something that we can't specifically get into this lecture, but there are lots of ideas on ways we can do that. Very briefly, ozone depletion. Basically, ozone's a natural component of the stratosphere. It's also a human-made propellant. What the ozone layer does is it shields us from ultraviolet radiation. So it's a good thing. It's protecting us from some of that incoming solar radiation. The ozone layer is good. It's been thinning. Happens over Antarctica. It's because of us. There was a 70% reduction in ozone over Antarctica and about a 10% reduction in Europe and North America. So this is what the hole looks like. Okay, you can see it right there. It was caused mostly by CFCs, which are called chlorofluorocarbons. They came in a variety of different things: coolants, aerosol propellants, styrofoam, you name it. What did we do? Well, what happened is we put all of these CFCs into the atmosphere, they broke down the ozone, and it caused a whole bunch of problems to wildlife and humans. Okay, so what did we do? Well, here's actually an environmental success story. We saw a problem and we fixed it. We started banning CFCs. We banned them in propellants back in the 70s in the United States. In the 80s, we came up with a worldwide agreement that said, hey, everybody's going to phase CFCs out in the 90s if you're a developed country, and by 2005 in developing countries. And guess what? It worked. The ozone layer is coming back, and we expect a full recovery sometime in the next, after about 30 years or so. We're going to see one, but it is going to come back, and it is working, and that's the good news. Acid deposition, another fancy name for acid rain. It's a type of rain that happens when you have sulfuric and nitric acids that actually fall out of the sky. It's because of fossil fuels being burned, mostly from coal-fired power plants. The sulfur and nitrogen oxides combine with water, and they make acid rain. What does it do? Kills birds, kills fish, kills forests, damages plants, damages buildings, damages rocks, damages statues. Limestone's very sensitive to acid rain. So what can we do? We have to reduce emissions of sulfur and nitrous oxides. And again, that's mostly what we're talking about, an issue with coal-burning power plants. Those are the big emitters of sulfur and nitrous oxides that we have. So if you use low sulfur coal, that helps. The only problem with low sulfur coal is there's not as much of it as there is high sulfur coal. That's what China uses. That's why it's really, really dirty when they burn it. Ours isn't quite as dirty, but it still isn't that great. So please make sure you look over the rest of the notes for Chapter 9. And that's it for this chapter.